while I wait for my panel, yes, please, yes, panelists assemble, please. All's good. So this is going to be a modern 21st century panel, and therefore we will be using Slido to take questions. And so hopefully you've all experienced this before, but essentially there's a QR code there, you can scan it, and then it should be fairly straightforward to put in your questions. Okay, these, right, fine. And so what I'm hoping to do is incorporate those in the discussion as much as possible.
Could we ask what we can do if we can't operate Slido?
If you don't have a mobile phone, very generously, I will allow one or two questions. One or two. Okay, I think we're missing... Yeah, we're missing. He's on his way. Okay. Wonderful. Well, okay. So hello, my name is Soumaya Keynes. I'm an economics columnist at the Financial Times. And this session is called Past its Sell-by Date. Does the UK need a new macroeconomic and fiscal framework? So obviously we've got the OBR, Treasury, the Bank of England. I think those are the big three. And we're having this conversation at a time when, as far as I can tell, there's not that much of a difference in the approach of the Conservative Party and Labour Party on what the right framework should be. I think you've got Rachel Reeves, who's promising something of an evolution. She says that there should be one fiscal event a year. I'll believe it when I see it. Yep. And also, she really, really wants to make sure that we don't have a repeat of the Truss debacle, so that the OBR can do its job. So that would be an evolution, and I think the question we're asking today is, should there be a revolution? And I'm hoping we'll get some fairly provocative statements and some good discussion. So in order, we're going to hear from Ethan Iletzki of the LSE, then we're going to hear from Karolina Alves of UCL, and then finally Michael Jacobs of the University of Sheffield. As I said, Slido is your friend. That's how most easily you can participate in the discussion. And so, Ethan, could you start with your opening remarks?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the introduction. I actually was here. I was just down. I didn't know which room to come to, so I was wandering the building. So we may hear some more revolutionary statements later, but I'm maybe going to be the more, let's say, subdued view maybe of the panel. I divide the, I think in general, given that I'm the first to remark, when we talk about the macroeconomic framework, we typically are talking about two main institutional features. One is monetary policy, the other is fiscal policy. And so the main theme of my introductory remarks are going to be that we can debate certain policy decisions of the monetary policymakers, but I think the overall framework that has been used in the UK for monetary policy has proven a good framework. On the other hand, the fiscal framework is a little bit in disarray and could use some rethinking. I'm not sure I'll have solutions today, but we will hopefully have an interesting discussion on that topic. So to begin with monetary policy, the UK, the Bank of England, was one of, I think, the global founders of the intellectual foundations of the notion of central bank independence and inflation targeting. And I will argue that it's been a relative success. So the intellectual foundations are that there is a time inconsistency problem in monetary policy whereby policymakers are tempted to inflate inflate away the value of the currency at certain times, and particularly so when the currency is under the control of politicians. And so the framework that has arisen in the UK, and many other countries have emulated this, is to allow an independent central bank who is given a inflation target and is asked to meet that target and consider other things only as secondary objectives. The overall, I think, so here's a chart from work by my colleague Ricardo Reis. It shows a very long history of episodes in England. And you can see the dots in the middle on the bottom are the recent period. I added the red dot just to include also the recent inflationary period, which doesn't change the picture much. And you can see that this is the best period in UK history, in English history, in terms of having, so on the y-axis we see how volatile inflation has been, and on the x-axis what has the level of inflation has been. And we can see that inflation has been, on average, pretty much smack on target during this period, and it has had the lowest volatility of any period in several centuries of English history. And so this is, if we think the objective is to keep a stable currency, this has been an unmitigated success. Now, there are some risks, and we saw some of them last year during the mini-budget crisis. Just to list them very briefly, one is the risk of political dominance, where the Bank of England loses its independence and politicians encroach on this. I think the risk of that is relatively low. We have heard both parties being very clear on their desire to maintain the independence of the central bank and to allow it to meet its inflation target. A second risk is financial dominance, and I think that is a substantial risk. Financial dominance is a situation in which the central bank inflates up assets, deflates away debt, seemingly because this is in the general interest, but partially because of the pressure of the financial system and actors in the financial system. I think that's a substantial risk in the UK and around the world. However, I think actually the mini-budget crisis was a good sign in that the Bank of England intervened to help out the financial system in a very short-term, very rapid, but very temporary way, which did not seem at any point to risk being dominated by financial concerns. The third risk is fiscal dominance, where the central bank is tempted to inflate away the public debt, possibly due to political pressures. And I think the risk of that exists, but I have argued in a few of my writings, which I invite you to read, that this never was a big risk. Even during the mini-budget crisis, there were some noises about this being a case of fiscal dominance. I think the data suggests that there was nothing of the sort happening, and so far so good, I would say, on the monetary framework. I would contrast that with the fiscal framework, where I view there being two problems. One is that the intellectual foundations, so the UK fiscal framework has been, I would say, has two pillars. One set up by the Blair-Brown first parliament, which is a fiscal rule, is following self-imposed rules on deficits and debt. And the second was established by George Osborne, where a Office of Budget Responsibility is the scorekeeper of deficits and debts in England. I would say the intellectual foundations for fiscal rules are far less well established. It's not clear who we are protecting from whom. Are we protecting politicians from voters, or voters from politicians, or politicians from each other? It's very unclear. Fiscal policy, budgetary policy is inherently a political, unlike monetary policy, which does not need to be a political matter. It always is a little bit, but it can be pulled out of that to some extent. I don't think there's any way to bureaucratize the budget. This is a political process. And so it's unclear what a fiscal rule is intended to achieve. Also, the evidence on its success has been, okay, I don't have that chart, unfortunately. Here we go. Has been limited. So here you can see the first part is before the UK had a fiscal rule, and the second part is after the UK has had a fiscal rule. You can see that deficits have been higher with a fiscal rule than before. Of course, there has been a global financial crisis and COVID, so it's not entirely the politicians' fault. But the problem here is not what's happening at the peak, but what's happening at the troughs. If you have a fiscal rule, sure, you might want an escape clause in a case of a crisis, but that means you need to really double down on lowering your deficit when times get a little better. But times apparently never get better in the UK. Maybe that's true. We'll hear that in later panels. But it's unclear that the fiscal rule has achieved anything, or there's no evidence that it's achieved anything. There are a few kind of recent pieces of evidence on fiscal targets actually being a de facto floor on deficits rather than a cap on deficits. And the logic here is exactly what we see in the UK, that when times are good, we just go up to the fiscal limit. And when times are bad, we say, well, we can't possibly meet our fiscal targets now. This is not the right time to do that. And actually, we have an unfolding example of that right now, where the chancellor can't seem to wait to give away in tax cuts, any limited reduction in deficit that we see. So if this is what happens every time there's even partial good news, it's hard to see how the debt ever declines. One last point is that the fiscal, let's say, looseness has not extended to public investment, and that I think is a real shame. In fact, public investment is far lower since the fiscal rules were imposed than before, and I think that is a major problem for UK fiscal policy going forward, and there unfortunately seems no appetite, particularly on the conservative side, but I think even on the Labour side, I'm not sure how adventurous they are on this, they will be on this in practice in expanding public investment substantially. So,
Great.
I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Okay, I think the only person who thought that the Truss debacle was good or had a good side, so that's great.
I didn't think it was good. I thought that
Had some good effects. Karolina, over to you.
How do I put that on? Is it on?
I think it's on, yeah.
It's on. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. So I wanted to have slides, but the deadline to send them was like 2 years ago, right? So I always prepare my slides one day before, so sadly I don't have slides. I wanted to start, looking at this question, does the UK need a new macroeconomic and fiscal framework? And I think it's clear that we do. I missed the first presentation, but I would risk saying that all the spectrums of the political debate, most of the economists, perhaps 99%, I reckon, or most of people here would accept the disappointing economic performance of the UK economy. You have economists pointing out the left behind areas. We have the entire issue of productivity, now the cost of living crisis, and not to mention the 10% inflation last year. So, I think would be madness to say we don't need to change anything and expect a different result from that. So for me, yes, we do need. And the real question is, why now? Again, it's a new framework, and how? And what I mean by why, it's not just enough to look and say, okay, the economic performance is not good enough. So of course we need a new framework. But I would think, okay, but what is driving this? Why the UK economy is not performing well? And I was thinking about, everything that has been said in the media, but also around the globe when it comes to understand why most of the economies in developed countries are not doing well. So, there is the story of the legacies of the financial crisis. Always there is the China issue, the erosion of democracy, across the globe impacting here, climate change, inequality, war, Brexit, another war, Trump. I had a joke about the marzipan thing, but I'm just going to say the conservatives. So I think, to me, is like we can look at all these aspects one by one, okay, and then think about the economic framework we have, the fiscal and the monetary one, as Ethan said, and trying to understand in each context what's happening. Or we can go all Tusians and call polycrisis, or go Gordon Brown and Muhammad El-Erian and say permacrisis, or Isabella Weber, overlapping emergencies and so on. And then really from that say, okay, it's a different moment. What we need is to check the economic theory that we've been relying on. And I could spend, and I thought about that, most of my time here going after orthodoxy, criticizing the unrealistic assumptions embedded in economic models, dismantle the Philip curve with empirical evidence and ask ourselves why we were spending so much ink on the flattening of the Philip curves when actually there is so many questions even before that. I could then criticize the model that led us to advocate for inflation targeting. I'm going to say the name of these models. And while on it, I could then spend time mocking a little bit the idea of rational employers and workers, and have a go at Lucas' 1972 paper. And then, of course, move to the grand finale, that is, if you have a wrong diagnosis for inflation, you have a wrong medicine. And I could go on and on and on. But I think, to me, the point is, all these lead us to a piecemeal critique of economics, of a new framework, of a new fiscal framework. And to me, what we need, and I have attended many events posing the similar questions. I think the last one with Soumaya, in a way, just about inflation. I think we are missing the real why, right? To me, if you look at the recent inflation failure, right? Although it was stable for a very long time, as Ethan showed us, we're supposed to have, from my perspective, beaten this because expectations were anchored. But quite honest, if you ask ourselves, we have to admit that they are not so anchored after all, right? Take John Kay, Marvin Keynes' books, Model and Radical Uncertainty. How long can we train our economists without actually having that at the center of the discussion? How narrow is the training and engagement we are giving to our economists, even when it comes to economic epidemiology, that now most of the departments of economics are open to it after the pandemic. But that discussion is there for a very long time, but the narrowness of economics did engage with that. The same with economic ecology. Why economists have never engaged with that work directly. But now that we are facing extinction, that there is a climate change issue, we are being more open. So to me, right, we've been focused on a mechanistic, like a mechanic economic models, and maybe Newton will be proud of us. But the only problem is that Newton was dealing with planets held in together by gravity. We are dealing with living systems called humans. But nothing in our economics is actually human. Moreover, we even disregard the fact that we are in an open system, and so we have to obey the laws of ecology. Production requires more and more extraction and leads to more and more waste. These are simply like a simple lessons that we've been ignoring in economics. So, if you look, if anything, there is nothing written in stone that says that all periods of time have the same volatility, and so we can use the same model. Looking back in history, that would be clear, absurd. So we're going through a period of more frequent crises, overlapping crises, and what happens when the economy is hit by a shock before? Does really return to equilibrium after another shock on an ongoing basis? Of course, to me, we can no longer form a rational expectation in that context because we don't know the compound effect of this. We can't coordinate. So going back to the Bank of England, which is what I'm kind of focusing more here, we can, of course, during the discussion, get into the academic and policy pipeline, and we know how the Bank of England is the exception because it has a brilliant in-house research. But I want to take attention to, what kind of macroeconomists the bank is hiring, and more importantly, their training. In the US, it's well acknowledged that in the recent decades, PhD graduates have taken over of the Fed, most of them from MIT. And this is a similar shift is visible in other major policy institutions around the world. That is, the models used in the policy institutions have been academicized. That word is not mine. In the last decades, there are studies on that. In the UK, this matter is worse because there's a persistent monoculture in macroeconomics that's reinforced by the REF, that is the REF, excellence, no.
Research Excellence Framework.
Yes, and also help to discuss this during the questions. So I'm happy to be challenged here, but I look at the Bank of England now, and I see a single type of model shaping banking policy, central bank policy making. I still see a heavy influence of DSGs and new Keynesian models. Yes, these models, they have evolved, improved, there have been developments within DSG models themselves, but I would risk saying that the bank is still very much relying on one type of model to think its monetary policy. Let's be clear, one tool, one set of principles have been responsible for the formulation and analysis of monetary policy in recent decades. This sounds to me a very narrow way to deal with a complex market economy, and why our economists can't be more creative, right? If you look at the academic rationale, the macro behind these models, we have the general equilibrium theory, microeconomic principles. We are talking about the interrelation between demand, supply, and monetary policy equations defined by microfoundation. We are talking about a business cycle which qualifies the general equilibrium. We are talking about human preferences and objectives being reduced to maximization of utility and profit. My point here is not to highlight, not to get into the criticism of the model itself, or the assumptions, or the question of human interaction. But I just want you to stop and think. We rely on one of the most important institutions in economy, and in the UK, with a tradition, as Jonathan Portes was highlighting, the institutional setting, this institution rely on one way to understand the economy, one foundation for the formulation and analysis of the monetary policy. Again, this to me is a very narrow way to deal with the complex market economy. So what I'm saying here, that's good. What I'm saying here is that, in my view, there's no possible discussion for a new framework, especially in terms of sustainability, in that case, in an environmental way, in an inclusive manner, without considering the capacity of the discipline of economics to give us that. With its focus on market, efficiency, and human interaction only through prices, I find that very difficult. We have to move away from this. Otherwise, what we're going to have is more DSG's development, more tweaks in economic theory, but economic theory that has alienated itself from human beings. And here I have a question for Ethan. You mentioned the inflation from 1997 to 2023, that was the best period. And then you said, but the risks, and you went on to discuss the risk. But my question is, what that means for the economy as a whole. I look at that stability and I think, okay, let's think about the growth, the level of debts, inequality, how we're dealing with a green transition. And quite honestly, if these others are not right, why that's, that to me is a failure. Doesn't matter that like little red ball. The other question I have is about the fiscal framework, and that's, I promise, is the last one. Yes, the fiscal rule is not clear, right? But again, what is the academic background is, right? Is idea that monetary policy is scientific, right? And fiscal policy is alchemy. And I'm sure Ethan knows the paper mentioned here from 2002. And the thing is, because of that, by default, fiscal policy doesn't, our students, undergraduate and graduate, there is no much spending time on fiscal policy. And even think of the name of the OBR, Office of Budget Responsibility. By default, we are already relying on balanced budget. There is no thinking, there is no creativity. It's just like no spending, which is one way, again, is one way to understand fiscal policy, and that's it. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I was hoping, okay. There is nothing worse than a panel where everyone agrees with each other, so I'm very excited about the discussion we're going to have. But before we get to the punch-up, Michael, can we hear from you?
Thank you very much, Soumaya. So I agree with Karolina's diagnosis of the problems. I think it would be remarkable if anybody thought our economy was performing well, and that does suggest that we need to look at the framework in a fundamental way. Our growth has been lower than in the past, over the past 15 years, considerably lower than in the previous period. Productivity has stalled, living standards barely risen. We have huge now growth of wealth inequality, partly exacerbated by policy. Quantitative easing, we have huge regional disparities, the most regionally unequal country in Europe, and we're not meeting our global greenhouse gas targets. So we have got considerable failure on our hands, and I think that does require us to rethink the framework. The big issue, the biggest issue of all, there are a number of things which have caused those problems, is low investment. The UK invests around 18% of our economy, of our GDP. The G7 average is 23%. The IPPR did a very nice little calculation about this. We've been below the median G7 level since 2005, and the IPPR did, this is public and private, did a nice little calculation of saying, well, what if the UK had been at the median, the G7, for investment as a proportion of GDP? And they worked out that that would have been an extra £563 billion worth of investment over the last 16 years that has not gone into the British economy because we've had a lower investment rate than the rest of the economy. That's £500 billion. That is a lot of investment, both public and private investment that would be. It's 14 times the cost of HS2. It's actually probably 13 times the cost of HS2's new figure, whichever that will be, and no doubt that is a lot of money. And that is the principal problem that we face. There are many others, but had our investment rates been up, we would have certainly managed to improve productivity more than we have done. That is the principal reason. We have far too few robots, not too many in our economy. We are not nearly as well capitalized as other economies. That's not just because we're a more service economy. We don't train workers nearly enough. We rely on a very flexible labour market which keeps wages very low. We have these huge regional inequalities. We also need investment to meet our greenhouse gas targets. So investment is a core problem. And that is not currently addressed by either the fiscal framework or indeed the monetary framework, although it is primarily a fiscal matter. So that would be my first complaint. And my first reform would be to, if we're going to have a fiscal framework of any kind, to say that our public investment should be at the G7 average, which is around 3%. It's scheduled to go down. It was up that for a very short time. It's scheduled to go down to just over 2% in 2027-28. Why? Because the government needs to cut spending overall in order to meet its absurd fiscal rule of reducing debt by the fifth year of the target. And the easiest thing is to cut capital expenditure. They're also planning, by the way, to cut current expenditure, to cut public services hugely in there, and I'll just come on to that in a second in their forecast. So let's have a fiscal strategy which is focused on public investment, and my view is that that is likely to increase the rate of private investment. So it seems to me that far from the crowding out thesis that used to dominate in kind of economics, we've now got much more evidence of a crowding in. I mean, not all public investment crowds in private, but certainly can do that. So that's the first part of it. The second point is around what Simon Redder-Lewis calls the consensus assignment of the responsibilities, the division of labour between the Bank of England and government. Bank of England doing monetary policy, government doing fiscal policy. This, as Ethan says, worked pretty well during the period when the economy was relatively untroubled. And it may have had something to do with the economy being relatively untroubled, or it may have been a coincidence that the things occurred at the same time. But during the Great Moderation, so-called, when, of course, the economy was doing well on the surface, although it was building up major problems underneath, we managed to get inflation under control, macroeconomic stability, and that was a good basis for the economy. The problem is when things go wrong. And we've had two interesting periods of when things have gone wrong since the great financial crash in 2008. So the first one was the slump, the recession that followed the crash. And here you had the extraordinary phenomenon of fiscal and monetary policy literally counteracting one another. So monetary policy as loose as possible, fiscal policy ridiculously tight, austerity. And these two things just working against one another, which most economists would say that they cancel one another, and they cancel one another out in the worst possible way, which is monetary policy became through QE, a huge inflation of assets, asset prices, asset values, asset wealth, while fiscal policy rained down on the poorest people in society. So the combination of those two things not only gave us a much slower recovery than in the United States, which was more expansionary in this period. It took a very long time for us to return to growth, and debt to GDP did not fall, which is what austerity was meant to do, because growth was so low, debt to GDP remained very high. So we didn't succeed in the ostensible aims of austerity, while causing a massive increase in inequality, bearing down on lowest incomes, public services for poorer sections of society, while inflating the asset values of the very rich. A pretty disastrous period. What should have happened in that period, and what I would reform the assignment of roles, is that the Bank of England should have been able to say publicly, I would have said in one of the letters that the governor has to write when things are not going well, to the government, we've got no room now to expand the economy more through monetary policy. We've hit zero interest rates, the lower bound. Please, it's your role now. And it's fiscal policy's role to stimulate the economy. But we didn't have that. That wasn't part of the mandate of the Bank of England, which is set by the Treasury, and we had an overly contractionary policy at that time. Very simple change, that would be. And if you've got a fiscal rule, a golden rule, which is no borrowing only for investment, you should allow it to be overridden during times of recession. You may think that the golden rule is a golden rule. Everybody should have it. The government doesn't have it now. Government does not have a golden rule. Labour does have a golden rule. Labour is saying in its fiscal rules it would borrow only to invest, and has also got the little rider, which is that when interest rates are near zero, then those rules should be overridden. And indeed, the Bank of England governor should write to the Chancellor to say so. So rather adopted exactly what I would say. The second interesting period is inflation, which we've had recently, where we've had an exogenous cost shock to the economy through higher energy prices and higher food prices. But the only tool we have for dealing with inflation is an increase in domestic interest rates. That's the only thing that the Bank of England can do. And of course, the interest rate in the UK does not affect that inflation, particularly its original causes. It does have some effect on inflationary expectations, definitely, although in a slightly circular way. But there are other things you can do on inflation. Inflation is effectively a distributional question, and there are tax measures that you could do, and indeed spending measures. And lo and behold, the government did them. The major policy on inflation was the energy price cap, which was completely contrary to orthodoxy, but it was felt to be so high that we had a price cap imposed. So I think and we could have done things, for example, on VAT. We could have had a temporary reduction of VAT, which would have taken the pressure off prices in the same way. So it seems to me that the consensus assignment is great when things are going well, but both in recessionary conditions and potentially in inflationary conditions, although I think that's a bit less certain, you need much more coordination of the bank and fiscal policy. In order to deal with those more difficult circumstances. The third thing I want to say then is about the rest of policy. We don't just have macroeconomic stability objectives anymore. Once upon a time, during the Great Moderation, we basically thought if you can control inflation, then the economy will do its thing and will generate growth, and government should focus almost entirely on the supply side. We now know that private sector investment in a globalized economy doesn't necessarily flow to where you might want it in a domestic economy. And so we have pretty much all accepted, possibly now with the exception of this government, that industrial strategy, industrial policy, guiding investment, private sector investment through the use of public spending, taxes and subsidies, is a useful way of generating investment in your own domestic economy. We've seen this in extreme form in the US, where the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a kind of protectionist, heavily subsidized model, is doing it one way. Europe trying to follow. The UK doesn't have the resources to follow. But industrial strategy is important. And why is industrial strategy important? Because we're not just looking for macroeconomic stability, we're looking for regional development, we're looking to support major sectors of the economy. But if you've got more objectives, if you have not just inflation growth, but also regional reduction in regional inequalities, you have support for key sectors of the economy, you have greenhouse gas emissions targets, you need more instruments. And at the moment, we are still, in our macroeconomic thinking about a relatively small number of instruments, and you need more coordination of those instruments. So I would like to see much greater coordination between Treasury and Bank of England, which I've already suggested, but also then the Department for Business and Trade, which runs industrial strategy, which should be part of that. And we've got other players. We've now got devolved governments, which also do economic policy in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We have a little bit of industrial policy attempted by city mayors and combined authorities, and we have advisory bodies which are now engaged in this field. We have a Climate Change Committee, which is doing a lot of interesting thinking about industrial strategy in practice, a low pay commission focused on low pay, as well as the OBR. I would like to see an economic policy coordinating committee which brought those things together and said, let's actually be grown up about the range of instruments, the range of institutions, and to try and get a more coordinated approach to reach multiple objectives.
Great. Okay, more coordination. Okay, Ethan, I feel like you had some questions directed fairly specifically at you, so shall I let you...
I feel I'm a little bit the odd man out here. In that I'm kind of being asked to defend an orthodoxy that I don't necessarily fully defend, but I'd be happy to play that role. So I think partially, so let me begin by saying that I agreed with probably about 90 to 95% of everything Michael said, which brings me to my first point, that I feel that Karolina's critique of the, say, the economics profession is critiquing an economics profession of 30 years ago and not really reflecting where it stands today. Indeed, I am, at the Department of Economics at the London School of Economics, and I don't find anything that was said here. We may disagree on details, but I didn't find anything here objectionable. I found it puzzling to hear that macroeconomists haven't worked on fiscal policy, given that that has been my career for the past 15 to 20 years. I recently have an article that studies the way in which government spending can increase private sector productivity, which is certainly not in what you would call the economic orthodoxy. This is being very well received in the economics profession. I don't think this orthodoxy that you refer to, my student, my former student, Reka Yuhaj, now at the University of British Columbia, has been a leading researcher on industrial policy. So I don't, advocating a lot of the policies that Michael has referred to. So I don't really feel like there's this orthodoxy that really needs to be. Sure, we can always hear more views and more. I welcome as many views as possible, but I don't think there's a fundamental ingrained view, and that other views aren't welcome. So for full disclosure, I am also an academic visitor at the Bank of England. I don't set their monetary policies, so I have no stake in that game. But that also gives me an opportunity to see a little bit of what Karolina was saying on the orthodoxy there. And I would agree with one part and disagree with the other. One is that on the demographic side, I fully agree with you that the choice of staff for the Bank of England could be more diverse and could draw from more disciplines. I fully agree with that. In terms of the openness, I really do not see that. I actually, if anything, I've seen enormous pressure from the leadership at the Bank of England to come up with some alternative frameworks, give us some agent-based modeling, give us big data with machine learning. And the problem is that none of these frameworks actually have provided a viable alternative. And so, we have something that works okay. And I think the natural thing is when you have something that works okay is to try to tweak it on the margin rather than to try to break it and start from scratch. The third thing that I would say, which I think came up, most in Karolina's points, but also in Michael's points, is sort of on giving the Bank of England more objectives. I have no problem with the Bank of England commenting on fiscal policy. The Fed does that. Many other major central banks do that. So I think they should feel free to do more of that. But asking the Bank of England to deal with inequality and climate change, of course they should consider their implications, the implications of their actions for this. But asking them to solve this problem is a little bit like telling, the Republicans in the US want teachers to have guns to defend their students. I mean, their job is to teach students, not to be the police. As important as safety is, there is expertise in a certain area. There are tools that the Bank of England has, and even, as Michael pointed out, even very crude tools to deal with the one thing they're mandated to do. Now asking them to use that one crude tool now to solve all the world's problems is actually an abdication by the politicians on their responsibilities. They have a responsibility to deal with these problems, and they want to throw as much as possible on bureaucrats so that they don't have to confront their voters in making their difficult decisions.
Can I just make clear before we go into I don't think the Bank of England should be asked to deal with climate change as a major objective. There are very specific things it needs to do on financial regulation, which it is beginning to do, not fully yet, but it is beginning to on its financial regulation side, because climate risk is a real financial risk. But no, what I want is a coordination of all the bodies which deal with the multiple objectives, and that's why you need coordination, because each has its own objective, but it must acknowledge that there are other objectives.
Just on the point of, I'm not asking the Bank of England to solve all the problems of the world, but what I'm saying is if we have the Bank of England, central banks, to manage the economy, why do we have them, right? To manage aggregate demand, the economy. So, the economy to me is much broader than have an inflation targeting that doesn't consider the rest. So just to give trying to make a very bad analogy here. When I was growing up in Brazil with high inflation, the government would never say the inflation is high. It would say, the rates of savings went up. Right? What I see with the Bank of England is, okay, the target is keep the target, but before, talk about everything that's going on in the economy that they're supposed to manage, and everything that's wrong. And then say, but the inflation, we kept the inflation target we achieved. That's to me is the issue. It's not, the thing is, and I will agree with Michael, I don't think it's just coordination. I think, coordination is important, and mandate is important, but all this is about the economy, right? So the communication has to exist, not just let's coordinate. Is that it doesn't make any sense if there is no communication. So it shouldn't deal with all the problems of the world, but clearly, if it is an institution to manage the economy, it has to talk to the economy. And I can't see that happening. And the other point on the fiscal, on the teaching, 3 years ago, but who are maybe, I can challenge that. Because if you go to the teaching of the best UK universities in the US and around the globe, and I do study that, it's the same teaching. You may have the financial crisis, we change. It's always like policy change, and then you think we're going to have this super change in our teaching, and we don't. You have exceptions regarding fiscal. You're not a rule, Ethan. You're not the rule of the profession. You're exception. Economists, by default, have our hostility towards fiscal policy. Right? Why we don't have, talk about coordination, why don't we have MPC and FFC, right? Why is always about the budget? Why we're not kind of brainstorming what actually fiscal policy is in a market economy? Not only because the interest rates are low.
Can I react to some of these? I mean, just a factual correction. There is no hostility to fiscal policy. There actually was a survey at the American Economic Association of, this is the most
No, I would
conventional
disagree with that.
thinking.
This is about multipliers. You're gonna say to me like
No.
yeah.
Go look at the survey. It
I do
specifically
look at the survey.
It specifically asks on whether fiscal policy should be used
Yeah,
as a stabilization tool. So what exactly is the hostility that you are
because it
sensing?
doesn't become part of the game. It is something that is like when we need it, you bring in. We have the automatic fiscal stabilizing, that's it. It doesn't have a central role like monetary policy has. And we don't teach our economists to actually give fiscal policy the central role. You don't, if you're teaching your students new Keynesian economics, it's impossible to tell them that fiscal policy has the same role than monetary policy. It's just impossible. And that's what we teach them. How are they going to be creative?
That's not
Can I?
exactly what we teach
Okay.
them.
So I'm gonna bring in some questions now, and I want to kind of build on this discussion, and just want to note that the most popular question that anyone has asked is, can we have the heating up in the room, please? So well done. Good question. But the other top question is by Frances Coppola, and she's asking whether the UK has relied too much on monetary policy to do the heavy lifting in times of economic crisis. And we've already heard, you want a letter. If we hit the zero low bound, we want a request for the government to do more fiscal policy. I suppose there's a question of how much, there is. I think one of the things that maybe Karolina was pointing to is that there is a bit of a resource imbalance between the economists that go to the Bank of England and the economists that go to, the OBR is a tiny organisation. The Treasury, there are actually, when I was at the Treasury many moons ago, I didn't have the word economist in my job title. It's, there are lots more generalists. There are economic teams, of course, but it's not like the Bank of England, where, economics is kind of, there's just a much higher volume and much more emphasis on economics. And I suppose the question is, does that matter? Should the OBR be changed? Should it be given a wider remit in what it does? How can we get to a point where we can change that balance of what monetary policy is expected to do and what fiscal policy is expected to do?
Can I, as a non-participant in this, I would love to be, but there are enough of them in this particular debate. Yes, fiscal policy should do much more work, but not just aggregate fiscal policy. The old model, the bastardized Keynesian model, was it's just about the aggregate numbers, and therefore it's the total amount of government spend, current and capital, and it isn't. It's also about where that goes. And which is really what industrial policy is about. Industrial policy is, largely speaking, founded on the idea that private sector investment doesn't just do the best for the economy. And it would be helped if it were guided into the things that governments think are better, either because governments have different objectives than private sector. Governments want money to go into different parts of the country, into key sectors that are regarded as strategic, or don't believe that private sector investment is sufficiently focused on productivity, improvement, and so on. So it's not just the aggregates, fiscal policy, which is why I think you need coordination of what the Treasury thinks about, which is largely the aggregates, and what the Department for Business and Trade should be thinking about, which is the specifics. And yes, I think fiscal policy should do much more. I would like to see public investment at levels, as I said, much higher. I would also like to see sensible discussion of fiscal rules. We are now in a utterly nonsensical debate about the apparent fiscal headroom that the Chancellor has for tax cuts. Nonsensical because every number that you hear bandied around, the 13 billion, is a difference between a figure in 5 years' time that comes out of the OBR's forecasts and another figure in 5 years' time that comes out of the OBR's forecasts. That is what this whole debate is around. And I don't know whether you heard Henry Zeffman, the BBC political correspondent, talking to Martha Carney this morning on the Today programme, all about how much headroom the Chancellor has. Is he managing expectations down about the size of the tax cut? And I wrote to Mr. Zeffman afterwards, and I've just had a reply from him acknowledging, saying this is all nonsense. You have to explain to your listeners that this is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. And no macroeconomist thinks that there is such a thing called headroom which should apply in this way. And Henry Zeffman has, to his credit, acknowledged that he should have done that. So the first thing we should do is just have a proper debate about how much what the government does in fiscal policy, both on the tax side and on the spending side, and yes, in response to Francis, much more on the fiscal side.
But I think earlier you said that you would be in favour of, I think, what Rachel Reeves is proposing, which is to not to have a rule which is that you don't borrow for non-investment spending, right?
Yeah, but that's the good rule. The silly rule is that debt has to be falling in the fifth year of the forecast. But that is what the fiscal headroom...
But the fiscal headroom still applies
in 5 years is conveniently always one parliament away.
And it's a forecast. It's a forecast. Look at 5-year forecasts and the outturns of 5-year forecasts. They are not things.
But you're still relying on a 5-year forecast if you only have a borrowing rule.
If you have a borrowing rule that is over a 5-year period, yes, but it is at least a rule that has some basis in economic theory and in the allocation of resources.
But how would you get rid of the... it is a problem when you're kind of seesawing and wildly changing fiscal policy twice a year in response to relatively small forecasting changes. But you still get that with a borrowing rule that's in any way forward-looking. So how do you...
Can I comment on that? I think the problem is not one, you saw I was pretty critical of fiscal rules in general, not because there's something wrong with having a rule, but just I think they kind of turn out to be irrelevant in practice. I think what's required is more long-term planning, maybe in the type of coordinated way that Michael pointed to. So the point is not whether we have this many billion or that many billion for a tax cut. The question is, we are going to borrow. A tax cut means we're borrowing more, and for what? What is we are intending to achieve? And the evidence on the stimulative or the productivity enhancing nature of tax cuts is very, very limited. And so why is that a high priority? There's probably some limit to how much we can borrow. I don't think we're anywhere close to that, but there's some limit to that. And we should ask, is it worth doing this? I mean, certain public investments, yes, we should be borrowing more for that. Tax cuts, it's just not worth, indebting our grandchildren in order to give away a short-term political benefit to a constituency. And so I think I would much rather that be the discussion than are we meeting, exactly how we're meeting a fiscal rule, which we imposed on ourselves anyway and can change at a whim if we wanted to. So.
Can I just have one comment on that? I agree with what both of you have said, and I just want to emphasize your point, like how we can give OBR more space, and I think is a fact it needs, but also I think would be very, I don't know if there's someone here from the IFS, but IFS is also someone obsessed about, this budget, and then I think, maybe people, OBR should not listen to them that much, or maybe IFS actually should finally put the macro section there to start thinking more about what fiscal policy can do and so on. So it's just like a final comment. Oh, and the investment, right? That's another thing. That's what I'm pushing, that it is a structural change. You can have a coordinate on investment, but let me make something very clear. And I know Jonathan I have a discussion with him on that. We can increase investment, fine. But what's a problem, especially in economic, such as the UK, and those who follow the Women's Budget Group would know, right? The question of care is a problem. elderly and children, right? And investment, so what they are pushing, investment is, it has to be measured. What's count as investment in the government is, you have to have a return. So most of the investment in what all of us want, more resilient society, more money for care, and so on, doesn't count as public investment. And if you talk to a macroeconomist, even progressive one, they're going to have a heart attack when they say, oh, let's have a purple investment. I mean, maybe you are into...
I'm not having a heart attack right now.
Maybe
so
you
yeah,
are into purple investment, but the thing is, no one wants purple investment, which will be in this kind of investment, a resilient society, where actually you consider the care economy. So it's not just investment, it's to rethink even what is investment, given the challenges we're facing now.
Can I quickly make a point? So first, I've long made the point that, you know, if you build a school and don't put any teachers in it, that'll be public investment. If you hire a few more teachers for existing school, that's called public spending. You know, as far as I can tell, the teachers are doing the teaching, not the buildings. But you know, buildings are important too. But I also have to make one small point too, that Karolina, you referred to the Bank of England not doing a job of managing the economy. The Bank of England has 15, or that it ignores managing the economy. It has 15 objectives, which I find far too many anyway. None of them state that it should be managing the economy. It has an objective to maintain the value of the currency, and there are a whole other set of institutions that have a collective job of managing the economy.
So the focus on monetary policy, that this institution is responsible, is for what? So what is not managing the economy? What? Because to me, it's like, if you go to any definition of why you need monetary policy, right, is stability, growth. So what is this 14 involved? Like, it's not about the economy, so it's about what? Just stability, completely detached from society? I mean, I don't understand what you're saying.
There are other institutions that deal with other things. So
why do you need why do you need central banks then? What they do?
Central banks decide the supply of currency in
but
the
that's
economy,
impact.
and
but that's impact
sure,
yeah.
They need to consider that too. But yeah.
Can I just put in again kind of, because the other issue here, which you touched on, which is why are tax cuts not a good thing economically? I mean, they're not being done for economic reasons. They're being done for entirely political reasons. But even if they were being done for economic reasons, governments always have a choice of how you stimulate the economy, and you've got tax cuts or you've got spending. And the big question there, which all economists would say, is what's the multiplier effect of a tax cut versus spending? Broadly speaking, pretty much all economists would agree, a tax cut is likely to have a lower multiplier effect because some of the money is saved, whereas public spending goes into the economy, depends on what. But the bigger question is, how do we what are these multipliers? And there have been quite a lot of orthodoxy around the size of the multipliers, and the OBR's multipliers are quite small. And this is a good subject which we ought to debate, but it ought to be debated as a question of policy making, and that should be in the hands of government. I don't want the Bank of England to have more role. It's a technical body. It should have a very limited role doing its technical thing. We should have a debate about what politicians should be doing with public spending and with taxation. And, you know, let's face it, on taxes, we think we're a very high tax country right now because we're about 35% of GDP. Well, if you look at the countries that have decent public services, you find that tax rates as a percentage of GDP are much higher. Sweden 43%, Belgium 43%, Austria 42%, France 45%, Denmark 46%, and lo and behold, these are the countries that have good public services. These are political choices. These aren't just economic technical questions. These are political choices about how we spend the nation's resources. I would prefer to live in a society with higher tax as a share of GDP, not a burden, by the way, not a tax burden, a share of GDP, because I would like better public services and I'd be prepared to pay my share.
And can complement that with a qualitative research that's challenging the grandchildren suffering, because if you ask, if you do a qualitative research asking people from their like 15 to 25 years, would pay more tax? What do you want? Is it okay to spend now to care? The qualitative research never says that, oh, yeah, no, we don't want it. They actually are fine with that, but that's a qualitative research.
Okay. I have one job, basically, which is to make the session end on time, and I think we're there. So, oh no, hang on. Oh, wait, no, it's fine. This is fine. Agenda was wrong. Anyway, yeah, that was a great discussion. Lots of disagreement there. And what more could I ask for? Have a great break.